Hello, and welcome to our discussion on the endocrine system of the human body. As always, this video serves to go over the highlights and main ideas of our course material. And as always, a student is hoped that they will dive into the textbook to give a more in-depth reading on the specific topics addressed in this discussion. So with this endocrine system, in this first part, we tend to talk about hormones, what they do and how they work, how these hormones might interact, and then we go very in-depth how the hypothalamus and pituitary gland work together to control the release of hormones. We've talked about many systems in this human body, and back in the previous semester, we discussed the nervous system and how that nervous system leads to homeostatic balances, correcting those imbalances. And then also we see that that nervous system was in charge of communication in the human body. Well, today we see that this endocrine system is quite similar to that nervous system. In other words, we are communicating, and more accurately, this endocrine system is a sort of master at homeostasis. These hormones kind of circulate freely through this body, and they blindly wind up at their target cell, and they're going to have an effect. So let's talk about how this endocrine system coordinates growth and development in the human body, and then also oversees some housekeeping functions in this human body. Our first slide serves as a sort of overview of this endocrine system. We see that, again, as we said earlier, this endocrine system maintains that homeostasis, but particularly of blood composition and also by its volume. And that's because we're going to regulate the concentrations of specific substances in this bloodstream. So on this slide, we see a variety of organs. This endocrine system is going to control some reproductive activities. It's going to regulate development, growth, and metabolism. And then it's also going to control some digestive processes. You can read this list of endocrine organs on the slide. Generally speaking, the cells within this organ, this endocrine system, can be organized as either a single organ with only endocrine function, or sometimes in this system we see small clusters of endocrine cells within other organs. So take, for example, the parathyroid glands, which exclusively have endocrine functions, whereas the pancreas, we'll discuss later on, has both endocrine and also digestive functions. We'll talk about that a little bit more later on. So the five major endocrine glands are going to be pituitary gland, pineal gland, thyroid gland, the parathyroid glands, and the adrenal glands. And the endocrine cells housed within other organs are going to be within the hypothalamus of the brain, the skin, thymus, heart, liver, stomach, pancreas, small intestine, kidneys, and gonads all have patches of endocrine cells that release hormones. So let's go into these, each and every one of these organs listed on this slide. By the way, here's a nice comparison of nervous system versus endocrine systems. We see that both the nervous system and the endocrine system are going to release ligands, and these ligands are going to be hormones or neurotransmitters, and their job is to communicate with the target cells, the cell that they're hoping to affect some sort of change out of. So we see general differences between the nervous system and endocrine system here. Take, for example, the time of onset of action. Within the nervous second, we're talking about implementation within milliseconds, extremely fast speed. Whereas the endocrine system takes a while to release those hormones. We get those hormones in the bloodstream. They circulate around, so it's going to take seconds to possibly hours or even days. Also the duration of action, take for example the nervous system, is starts and then finishes very briefly. Generally longer is what these endocrine system hormones are going to do, because the chemicals stay in the bloodstream circulating for a while. Well, let's take a closer look at these things called hormones. So these are going to be chemical substances, and so that means these are not going to be visible with the naked eye or not even a microscope. These hormones have biochemical structures. So a fun fact for the day is that if you took all the hormones that your body made in your entire lifetime, they would all chemically fit in a teaspoon. So tiny chemicals, big, powerful changes. So on this slide, on the upper left, we see the endocrine cell. Again, that could be a cell within a gland, or that could be a cell within a larger organ. And that's going to be releasing hormones, shown here with the gray dots. These hormones enter the bloodstream and get into the blood. And notice how they're moving through a blood capillary. And they blindly sort of circulate through there. They pass up many other possible places to latch onto, but they pass them up, waiting for their target cell. And we can see that on the bottom. We have target cells that we expect a sort of change out of. Now, we can see in this diagram there are hormone receptors, and on a more microscopic level, we see that the hormone and the hormone receptor acts as a sort of lock and key mechanism. So in other words, a hormone will only have a certain biochemical structure that'll allow it to only bind with a certain specific hormone receptor. So speaking of those biochemical structures, here's a slide showing some of those biochemical structures. We have a couple hormones shown on here. Students need not worry to memorize these biochemical structures. We'll save that for your biochem class. But for our class, we should talk about the two main categories of hormones, and those are going to be lipid-soluble hormones and then also water-soluble hormones. The transportation of these water-soluble hormones, shown on the bottom, involves dissolving these hormones in the hormone molecules into the blood plasma. So recall that blood plasma has a high amount of water in it. Then for the transport of the lipid-soluble hormones, shown on the top of this slide, that's going to be dependent on water-soluble carrier proteins. And these carrier proteins do exactly what they say. They carry the hormone to their target cell. So any hormone attached to a carrier is called a bound hormone, whereas an unattached hormone is going to be a free hormone. And so only a free hormone is generally able to exit the blood and bind to the target organs. And just generally speaking about the concentration of these, recall that these hormones exert their physiologic effects as a result of their concentration within that blood. So the idea is that the more concentrated that hormone is, the more dramatic the effect is. And so therefore, we can influence that concentration, and that's done through hormone synthesis, in other words, the creation of that hormone. And then also we can eliminate hormones as well, and those two features will have an effect on the concentration of these hormones. So the hormone synthesis is going to occur in the endocrine gland. Therefore, a higher rate of synthesis produces a higher concentration of the hormone. hence a stronger effect. Then another way to control the concentration is hormone elimination, and that's going to occur through enzymes. Enzymes are going to degrade those hormones, and that's usually occurring in the liver organ. And so basically a higher rate of elimination produces a lower concentration of the hormone, thus lessening the effects of that hormone. So in summary, water-soluble hormones have short half-lives, and these lipid-soluble hormones have long half-lives. So let's go more in depth into each of these. We'll start with our lipid-soluble hormones. Again, in this diagram, we see a blood capillary up top, and we see how hormones are liberating themselves out of that capillary and diffusing into the cell membrane of the target cell. So these lipid-soluble hormones are relatively small, and they are nonpolar molecules. So because they are nonpolar, that means we call them lipophilic, and because of that, they are able to kind of bind with those lipids that are in the cell membrane, and therefore easily diffuse across the plasma membrane of the cell. Well, upon entering this cell, the hormone is then going to bind to the intracellular receptors, and those are located in the cytosol or possibly in the nucleus of the cell. So the idea here is that the hormone receptor complex, that is, the complexes where they've been bound together, binds to a particular DNA sequence within that nucleus, and that's going to result in a subsequent transcription and translation of proteins. So in other words, thanks to the binding of these lipid-soluble hormones, we can turn on and turn off specific genes. Now let's take a look at these water-soluble hormones. These are polar molecules, and therefore they are unable to cross the plasma membrane, and therefore they need to bind to a plasma membrane receptor. And we see in this image above, once again, there's the blood capillary. Notice how the carrier is absent in this situation. So the hormone attaches to the outside of that cell membrane. And then this binding is going to initiate a series of biochemical events. We're going to call this a signal transduction pathway. So things get a little bit complex in this pathway. So let's go take a look at this. We first start by the hormone is going to act as the signaling molecule. We also call the signaling molecule the quote-unquote first messenger. Well, the binding of the hormone to that receptor then forms a second messenger in the cell. And in this situation, it tends to be adenylate cyclase. Well, both common signal transduction pathways function through an internal plasma membrane complex. That's going to be called a G protein. And that G protein is going to change from an inactive form to an active form once we have that binding of that hormone happening on the outside. So the idea here then is that suddenly activated G protein generally activates the adenylate cyclase or the phospholipase C. And then lastly, we see that this adenylate cyclase is going to be a plasma membrane protein that's going to increase the formation of cyclic AMP. That's what they mean by CAMP there. Increase the formation of cyclic AMP from ATP, that is adenosine triphosphate, when activated. So this in turn is going to activate protein kinases that phosphorylate other molecules. So in other words, what does this mean in the big picture? It means that hormones can bind to this plasma membrane, and it can initiate a cascade of events. So long story short, this sort of hormone can result in amplifications. So low concentrations of this can lead to a powerful amplification of that signal. So in our previous situation, we saw that the binding of a hormone, that first messenger in other words, and then the production of a second and third messenger is ultimately going to result in activation or possibly inhibition of enzymatic pathways. So in summary, there's many different ways how they work. So as we said earlier, we've already talked about step one, or one possibility I should say, how a hormone binds the cell surface or the receptor inside a target cell. What is the effects of that? Well, this cell might change the permeability of a membrane. It might synthesize new molecules. It might alter the rates of reactions. Let's take, for example, a couple examples of water-soluble hormones. Glucagon, for example, that's going to be released from the pancreas, and that's going to act on the liver. Another example is oxytocin. That's released from the pituitary gland. That's going to act on the smooth muscle of the uterus. So another example of how hormones might influence is stimulating mitosis or inducing secretions. And then also we see that each target cell is going to respond to a hormone differently. So let's take, for example, the hormone insulin. Remember that this hormone is freely circulating through all of the blood, going through almost every single vessel and capillary in the human body. Only when that insulin arrives at liver cells does it stimulate glycogen synthesis. Well, that same exact insulin hormone can blindly circulate and arrive at adipocytes, in other words, cells working with adipose. Here, the same molecule insulin is now going to stimulate triglyceride synthesis. So in summary, hormones work by binding to the cell surface or actually inside the cell. They then can have a variety of effects, and then that target cell can also affect differently. Let's now take a look at how hormones might interact in a sort of a complex manner. It turns out this target cell, and by the way, when I say target cell, it could be bone, it could be muscle, it could be any tissue being influenced or acted upon. This target cell can be influenced by more than one hormone. So, in other words, a target cell can simultaneously bind different hormones, and then these can interact in different ways. So we have three types of interactions of hormones: permissiveness, synergism, and antagonism. This first one, permissive interaction, that's going to occur when the activity of one hormone requires a second hormone to function. So let's take, for example, estrogen. The production of estrogen is stimulated by another hormone. Then we see synergism. Synergism is going to be when the activity of one hormone reinforces the activity of another hormone. So let's look at this example here. Looks like the liver is going to produce glucose. So in other words, we can take glycogen and break it down to glucose. And that's because pancreas is sending hormones to the liver, and also the adrenal glands are going to be sending epinephrine to the liver. So with these two hormones working together, we have a dramatic, more concentration of production of glucose. And our third type of interaction is going to be antagonism. This antagonistic interaction occurs when the effects of one hormone opposes the effects of another. So let's take, for example, coming back to this liver again, we see that the pancreas can also secrete insulin, and that insulin insulin can have an opposite effect of glucagon. We would say those are antagonistic cells. And so together, glucagon and insulin work together to regulate blood sugar levels in the blood. All right, let's take a look at the control of hormone release. And the main feature of the endocrine system is going to be a negative feedback system. And we've seen this before because we've talked about homeostatic imbalances before. Well, in a negative feedback system, we see step one is that the hormone is produced. There's some sort of need for that hormone somewhere. And then as these hormone levels increase, that causes an effect on the target organ. So therefore, the target organ has reached its desired effect. And then the result of that desired effect is going to lead to inhibition of further hormone release. The idea here is that if we had too much of something, that would be bad. So let's take, for example, on this diagram here, we see a sort of a balancing act happening. Notice at the fulcrum of the lever, we see that it's a good idea to have a certain amount of calcium in the bloodstream. Let's say, for example, 9 to 11 milligrams out of 100 milliliters of blood. That's our balanced level. Recall that a homeostatic imbalance is where something's off. So notice in the lower right, we see falling blood calcium levels. That's an imbalance. So this causes parathyroid glands to then release a hormone called parathyroid hormone. And this parathyroid hormone is then going to stimulate osteoclasts to degrade bone matrix. You might remember from the skeletal system that we have osteoclasts that kind of break down bone matrix, and that's going to release calcium back into the bloodstream. So now that we have released a sufficient amount of calcium in the bloodstream, we've brought up the calcium back to a normal level. But again, it's important that we inhibit that releasing of parathyroid hormone so that we can make sure that not too much calcium enters the bloodstream, or we have not broken down too much bone matrix. And here's another way that we might release hormones. And this slide serves to compare three different types: a humoral stimulus, a neural stimulus, and a hormonal stimulus. Our first type is going to be a humoral stimulus, and that's going to occur when an endocrine gland secretes hormones in response to a changing level of nutrients, or maybe a changing level of ions in the bloodstream. So in here, this example, we see that a low concentration of calcium is going to stimulate those parathyroid glands to secrete parathyroid hormone. We've already talked about that, but again, now we see that that is called a humoral type of stimulus. The second type is a neural stimulus, and this nervous stimulation is going to occur when an endocrine gland secretes hormones in response to direct stimulation from the nervous system. So in this middle slide, we see that the spinal cord has gray matter, and coming out of that gray matter are sympathetic fibers. And you might recall that we sometimes have a fight or flight response in this nervous system. So notice how this nervous fiber innervates the medulla region of the adrenal gland, and that's going to have it secrete catecholamines, and those are going to end up in the blood capillaries. So we see that here the nervous system is going to secrete, or at least send the impulse to secrete that hormone. And by the way, these are done through reflexes in that central nervous system. And our third type, a hormonal stimulus, that's when hormones from one endocrine gland stimulate another endocrine gland to secrete hormones. So let's take, for example, the third panel where we see the hypothalamus is secreting hormones. Notice how that hypothalamus secretes hormones down to pituitary gland, which is then making other endocrine glands secrete their own hormones. So take, for example, the testes are going to be secreting testosterone under the influence of the pituitary gland. So there's many different ways for hormones to be released. We've talked about 3 or 4 of them. And at this point, we get to round out our discussion in the first part of the endocrine system, talking about this relationship between hypothalamus and pituitary. So this is a little bit of a review back from the nervous system. So we're going to dive in and take a sagittal view of this brain. And with a sagittal view, you might recall structures such as the cerebrum, in other words, the cortex region. We had this diencephalon region, and then we had a cerebellum, and then also a brainstem region in this brain. So what we're doing is we're diving more in depth into this diencephalon region. We're looking here at the hypothalamus. So this hypothalamus is going to be a sort of integrating link between the nervous system and the endocrine system. This hypothalamus is going to receive input from that cortex, the thalamus, the limbic system, and internal organs. That limbic system is shown, there we go, in tan. Limbic means border, so here we are making a border of that diencephalon region. Then the hypothalamus, as we'll soon talk about, is going to control the pituitary gland with 9 different hormones. So let's go in depth into those guys. It is noteworthy that there's a little bit of changing in terminology throughout times. We used to call at one time pituitary the master gland, but nowadays we might call perhaps hypothalamus the master gland, because as science evolves, we find out that the hypothalamus is actually sending messages to the pituitary gland. Perhaps a better way to view this endocrine system is that there actually is no master anywhere in this system. Some of these glands are behaving independently of what pituitary or hypothalamus is doing. All right, so we start off talking about some pituitary anatomy. We're going to start off talking about neurohypophysis. In other words, these are going to be neural impulses sent through the pituitary gland. In a few minutes, we'll contrast that with the adrenohypophysis, in other words, hormone-based communications. Well, we've already talked about how the hypothalamus is part of that diencephalon region of the brain. And so coming out of that hypothalamus is going to be pituitary gland. And this pituitary gland is located inferior to that hypothalamus. And you might recall from the skeletal system, we had a structure on sphenoid bone, and that structure was called sella turcica. Now we see that that sella turcica acts as a sort of pocket of bone that pituitary gland can simply relax in and be nestled tightly and deeply protected. Notice that there's an infundibulum, that is a thin stalk that connects the pituitary gland with the hypothalamus. And then this pituitary gland is partitioned structurally and functionally into a posterior pituitary gland and then an anterior pituitary gland. When we say structurally, that means if we took a look at the histology, there would be differences in histology. And if we look at the functions are different between anterior and posterior. So this slide is now going into the posterior pituitary gland. That's going to be the neural part of this pituitary gland. So we see that there's a sort of neural connection between hypothalamus and posterior pituitary gland. Let's go ahead and look at some of the hormones that it releases. Our first that we discuss is going to be oxytocin. And oxytocin is a hormone, And again, keep in mind this is going to be released by the posterior portion of the pituitary gland. And its target cells are going to be uterus and also mammary glands. And the functions of this are going to stimulate uterine contractions. In other words, it's going to initiate labor, but also it's going to help initiate milk ejection in those mammary glands. Furthermore, there's some research that suggests that oxytocin is released in certain social bonding activities, such as sexual intercourse. Now, just to clarify, these hormones are manufactured in the hypothalamus region of the brain, and they move down into the posterior pituitary lobe, where they are going to be secreted and move into the bloodstream in that manner. Our next hormone we discuss is antidiuretic hormone. That's also called vasopressin. And this is going to target the kidneys, also sudoriferous glands and arterioles. And the idea is that these, when ADH is released, it's going to decrease urine production. It's also going to decrease sweating and increase blood pressure. So the name kind of says a lot about it. Antidiuretic means it's stopping urination. And so if we stop urination, we're more likely to accumulate water, and therefore we can maintain a hydration. Now, if we have adequate hydration, well, then ADH is going to be inhibited. And it's also worth noting that alcohol is a sort of, shall I say, an antidiuretic hormone. So in other words, when a person sometimes consumes too much alcohol, they sometimes find themselves urinating very much, hence they're getting rid of lots of water in the human body. So in summary, this pituitary, this posterior pituitary is going to secrete oxytocin and ADH. And lastly, it's noteworthy that this oxytocin does have a dramatic effect in labor. I think some students are interested to know that during labor, sometimes a female is given a synthetic version of oxytocin. That's called pitocin. And pitocin is a synthetic form that's going to initiate that labor and make those contractions a little bit more likely to occur. Well, now we move into this anterior portion of the pituitary gland. So that means we're looking at the portion to looker's left on the diagram. And we see that this hypothalamus and this anterior pituitary gland are connected by a hypophyseal portal veins. These are going to connect the primary capillary plexus of the hypothalamus to the secondary capillary plexus of the anterior pituitary gland. We might call this blood vessel network a hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system, which provides a direct blood pathway between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland. Let's go ahead and take a look at some of the hormones that are secreted by anterior pituitary through adenos hypophysis. Our first one we discuss is growth hormone. And as we see here, the targets for growth hormone are going to be things like liver, muscle, and bone. So this growth hormone is going to stimulate linear growth at the epiphyseal plates of those bones. It's also going to result in hypertrophy of muscle and also some other physiologic changes, such as immobilizing the liver. Well, growth hormone is going to release, growth hormone releasing hormone from the hypothalamus regulates the release of growth hormone from the anterior pituitary. And so when GHRH, the growth hormone releasing hormone, is produced and released by that hypothalamus. That's typically in response to a person's age, the time of day, nutrient levels in the blood, stress, and exercise. So one of those targets of growth hormone are going to be hepatocytes in the liver, and that's going to produce insulin-like growth factor. And growth hormone and insulin-like growth factor have overlapping functions, but this IGF, the insulin growth factor, is going to be responsible for greater response from target cells. So the idea is that by releasing growth hormone, we're going to stimulate cell growth. We're going to mobilize fats, and we're also going to spare glucose. Sometimes we get homeostatic imbalances of growth hormone. So for example, if we had a lesser amount of that growth hormone being produced, that might lead to dwarfism. If you may have seen certain movies, perhaps I'm sure you're aware, dwarfism is common. And then gigantism. If we had too much growth hormone, that could lead into gigantism. Take, for example, Andre the Giant, famous wrestler, had a tumor on his pituitary gland. Well, another hormone released by this anterior pituitary is going to be a thyroid stimulating hormone. We'll talk more about thyroid later down the road, but for now, thyroid gland is going to be the largest body structure devoted entirely to endocrine activity. Well, let's look at some structures. We have a right lateral lobe and we have a left lateral lobe. And it's interesting that they are connected by an isthmus. That's a term borrowed from geography. Isthmus is a piece of land that connects two main bodies. And well, later on, we'll take a look at thyroid gland and see how it's around there by thyroid cartilage and down by trachea. But the idea here is that thyroid stimulating hormone is going to stimulate thyroid to make its own hormones. And as always, we have homeostatic imbalance. We have things like hypothyroidism, where that thyroid is not active enough, and hyperthyroidism, where that's too active. We'll talk more about those guys in a few minutes. But in summary, this thyroid is also going to increase the base metabolic rate. So once again, we have an example of a hormonal stimulus where thyroid stimulating hormone will affect thyroid hormone. Now we talk about another hormone that affects another adrenal gland. So in other words, pituitary gland is going to release a hormone that influences adrenal gland to release its own hormones. And so these adrenal glands are paired endocrine glands. You might recall that they're anchored to the superior surface of each kidney. And there's two major regions to this adrenal gland. There's the medulla, the inner region, and that's going to secrete catecholamines called epinephrine and norepinephrine. And then the cortex, the outer region, is going to be partitioned into many different zones. Later on, we'll talk more in depth about zona glomerulosa, zona fasciculata, and zona reticularis. The idea is that pituitary gland is secreting adrenal corticotropic hormone, in other words, ACTH. And once ACTH is released, remember that it's going to blindly circulate through the bloodstream, and it's going to suddenly arrive at the adrenal cortex. And once it arrives at that cortex, it's going to release glucocorticoids and androgens, and this is in response to a stress effect. Okay, let's look at another hormone released by pituitary, and that is prolactin. This is going to have a target cell of mammary glands. And the idea here is that it's going to lead to an increase in milk production. The name kind of says it all, prolactin. Pro meaning for, lactin meaning for milk. It's interesting that it has an unclear role in males. But remember that these hormones are still sort of blind in how they act and how they function. In other words, even if a female is not giving birth, even if she is not pregnant, if she were given prolactin, that would indeed stimulate those mammary glands to start producing milk. Let's look at another hormone released by pituitary, and that is follicle-stimulating hormone, and then also luteinizing hormone. These are both going to have effects on ovaries and testes. Same hormone, but it's a little bit different as to its functions or its effects on ovaries and its effects on testes. So the idea is that when the hypothalamic neurons release gonadotropin-releasing hormone, that's going to happen during puberty. The effect of follicle-stimulating hormone is it's going to stimulate the testes to produce sperm. That's going to be our reproductive cell. And then the ovaries are going to be stimulated to start creating eggs, the female part of the reproductive cell. And then luteinizing hormone is going to promote the production of gonadal hormones. So as we said earlier, these sexual organs also have endocrine functions, and those endocrine functions are releasing estrogen, progesterone, testosterone. That's all done thanks to luteinizing hormones. These are inhibited by that negative feedback mechanism we talked about earlier. So we'll talk more in depth about these gonads a little bit later on in our discussion. And we arrive at our last slide of part 1 of endocrine system. And this is just a nice overview of hypothalamus and pituitary and how they interact. In summary, a student who's studying this should focus on the major idea. What is the gland? What hormone does it release? And what is the effect of that hormone? That's a good general study pattern to have. Well, this is going to conclude part 1 of the endocrine system. Stick around for part 2. That's coming up in the next segment.